Okay, so in this video I'll be comparing both GT and Dragon Ball Super's art styles, and I find this topic quite interesting as both deviated from the traditional Z look and did it in very similar ways, such as less angular designs and utilizing highlights a lot more with characters, and characters' faces becoming much wider. Now with this comparison I'll be comparing mostly the character sheets, as for one, obviously many different animators worked on the series, and each therefore provided a varied range of styles, and it would be almost impossible to compare each artist and each style together. And I'll be comparing these sheets also back to Dragon Ball Z's and how well they replicate the style, as I feel that this is a direction that the designs should at least somewhat try to follow for consistency's sake, and well, also because I prefer the older styles. But so let's first start this comparison with Goku. So you'll notice in GT that there is a slight dip on the side of Goku's face, however his jaw is very rounded off, and he still has somewhat a pointy little nose. Much different to Z of course, where the side of his face had much more of a curve and the jawline was much more angular. However, when looking at several illustrations from the Buu saga by Toriyama, you'll realize there is some similarity of Nikatsuru's design of GT Goku in regards to the more rounded off jawline. Of course, it's not drawn to the same extent, but it is similar. However, with colour illustrations, Toriyama would draw them slightly less angular to how he would draw them in the manga, in most cases anyway. Most likely since it was for like a colour illustration, he would put more time into it. Then with Dragon Ball Super, it's kind of a mix between the two. Again, the side of his face hardly curves, however his jawline is basically drawn with an almost straight line. So it isn't as round as his design in GT, but it isn't as curved and angular as Z either. However, you'll notice his nose kind of curves outwards. And on a side note, although it doesn't appear in the character sheets I showed before, this is also a trend seen throughout GT. Of course, in it doesn't always look like this in every single episode, however it is still featured often, especially in Super, whereas in Z, in both manga and anime, it often curved inward. Of course, different animators would inject their own style, so little features such as this may change, but generally this was the look of the series. And with Vegeta, you'll notice again this trend of moving away from the angular designs in regards to the face, and this is probably the most drastic change in style ever in the series. And I thought I might chuck the design from DBS Broly just for fun in this comparison. So again, there is a slight dip inside of his face, however his chin is much wider, which is another little stylistic choice I didn't mention before, which you'll see throughout the majority of designs in GT, such as Gogeta Super Saiyan 4. And well, with Vegeta, his widow peak seems to be much smaller and his nose isn't as pointy. However, features like arms, chest and legs are still drawn in the same blocky look, and to me look pretty much identical to the end of Z in both the anime and manga. And well, the same with the ears, which of course had become much smaller by this time anyway since the earlier days of Z. With Dragon Ball Super Vegeta, the features of the face are pretty much the same in regards to style as Goku. Not necessarily as sharp as Z, but not rounded off as GT either. However, one noticeable change to point out is the widow's peak, which has been reduced even further, and he is slightly less bulky. Then comes the DBS Broly sheet of Vegeta, which is the closest in style wise to the Z sheet, with a slight indent in the side of his face and the jaw, not as much as the DBZ character sheet, but still more than Super and GT. And Vegeta's widow peak returns to form again, not as large as Z, but it is larger than GT and Super. And the pointy nose returns, and again the ears are pretty much the same as Z, but the anatomy of Vegeta's body is quite different than all of the character sheets, with the line work of the muscles, especially the biceps and shoulders, not being joined together. And this design choice somewhat kind of heralds back to the earlier days of Z, well, all early Dragon Ball in general, where they would kind of draw a single round line with some pen strokes added to define the bicep and shoulder. However, around the Namek arc, Toriyama and the anime staff, most likely replicating his style, begin to draw more angular to define muscle structure, and you'll notice how the line work kind of joins together more, so to say, around the latter parts of the Frieza arc, and predominantly in the whole Android and Cell arc. And so when looking at it, I would have to place it around the Frieza saga in terms of how the muscle structure is drawn. And so overall, in regards to style, with GT, the way the body was drawn from my perspective was closer to Dragon Ball Z, with characters still retaining that bulky look throughout episodes, and in the character sheets especially. Although I guess Nikatsuru's design of GT Goku is an exception, but that doesn't mean characters are drawn necessarily thin throughout Super. but more so that they just never look as bulky as they were portrayed in GT, although the Tournament of Power did attempt to change things up a bit. So with the design regarding the head in the character sheets, I believe that Super was somewhat more closer to Z than GT. As I mentioned before, GT had a trend of giving characters very large chins and made the head overall wider as well. That's not to say that Super didn't do this as well, as both were similar in this regard, but Super was never to the extent of how they were portrayed in GT. Now with the colour scheme, both in this regard were somewhat similar to each other in their colour palette, and again both deviated away from Dragon Ball Z. So generally with Dragon Ball Z going off the character sheets, the skin tones used specifically for Goku were a milky white for the base skin colour, and the shading was usually a deeper light shade of salmon pink. Of course, the colours used in the actual episodes weren't always exactly the same as the character sheets. For example, Goku may be depicted with a lighter shade of pink, or Vegeta may be coloured with a very pinkish red colour, but then be depicted with a more orange-brown colour, and then in another episode a dark beige colour. And with the promotional art, it could change a lot between different posters, although it is worth noting that not all, but a lot of these posters seem to use a bronzy orange for skin tones, quite often seen consistently throughout many pieces of promotional work. When it comes to the colours used to depict Super Saiyan, the character sheets used a lemon yellow for the base and a nice golden yellow for the shading. Promotional work once again featured a wide variation of these colours. For example, in this piece the hair is an apricot orange and the base is a light pale yellow. Then in this next piece the orange is toned down, however a clay brown is used for the extra shading. In the anime it's pretty much the same thing. Sometimes a deep shade of orange is used, or a more golden yellow or bright yellow combined with a pale yellow base colour. Although keep in mind of course that these colour schemes in the anime are utilised when the users are meeting aura or powering up. And although I didn't mention this before in regards to the skin tones, when emitting aura, the skin colour almost always becomes a light pink / pale white with a deep reddish brown for additional shading. Sometimes it could become a deep salmon pink, but generally the colours used would usually be some sort of pink combined with a shade of brown. And lastly, when not powered up, the Saiyan hair would usually use a pale yellow and a dark ivory colour, and this colour choice was pretty consistent throughout episodes and the entire series for that matter, with little to no variation. Now when looking at GT Goku, of course, as we all know, his skin tone changes completely. It is probably the most drastic change of colours ever in the series. His skin tone now is a yellowish brown and the shading is a brown sandy colour. Interestingly enough though, however, I realise that this design used here is actually just a recolour of the one drawn for Goku right at the end of Dragon Ball Z. Now, I couldn't find any pictures of a coloured Super Saiyan in the character sheets or one of Vegeta, so I'll go straight to the anime. Again, as I previously mentioned, the colours in an episode wouldn't always be exactly as the character sheets, especially in the last episode of GT where his skin tone becomes more of a brown pinkish colour, but overall he would usually have a yellow brownish tone throughout most episodes, and the reason for the change of skin colour in regards to how he was in Dragon Ball Z was possibly to match him closer to the colours Toriyama used for Goku's skin in his illustrations, where he coloured him with a lot more shades of brown. However, in some illustrations Goku has more of a pinkish skin tone, so the reason for these random changes between skin tones in Toriyama's work was most likely that it simply came down to what colours Toriyama had available at that time. But interestingly enough, in the ending 4 of Dragon Ball GT, in the last scene it shows Goku with a white pinkish skin, and the colours used for his gi are the same from the colour sheet from the end of Z that I showed before, not GT's like you might have expected. And I guess what's strange is that they depicted him looking tan just a couple of seconds before, but perhaps it's because they did show a sequence of him through the years and he was given the same colours as back in Z for this walk sequence, so it's possible that it's a direct reference or tribute to the end of Dragon Ball Z Goku, but that's just speculation. But adding more to the confusion, in the GT movie A Hero's Legacy, the base colour used is more of a beige colour, and the second layer was an orangey brown tone, which is more closer to Dragon Ball Z, yet the poster for that movie has Goku looking tan again. So yeah, I don't know what the reasoning was for the weird colour changes towards the end of the series in GT, but as we know, it remained brown / tan for the majority of the series. And then if that wasn't enough, Goku's given another skin tone for when he is in the Super Saiyan 4 form, which is not only different to how he was depicted in his base form on the character sheets of GT, but it also is much different to how he was portrayed in the Buu arc, although this segues nicely onto the other characters as well finally, because much like Goku in his Super Saiyan 4 state, which usually used a pale whitish yellow rather than a pinkish white like in Z. Other characters such as Trunks, Vegeta, and even Pan are featured with similar yellow/brown colours. Of course, not every episode always uses these exact colours. For example, this picture of Gogeta or Goku, for example, both used a whitish pale base colour and a light sort of beige for the second shade, and a soft pastel brown, which is not a colour I remember being used hardly at all for shading in Z, if ever, and is a small colour choice seen more in GT. However though, you will notice regardless that pinkish skin tones are being barely utilised anymore. Also, highlights are becoming much more common now with the promotional art. However, it is almost a standard now. That's not to say the promotional art in the Boo arc wasn't utilising highlights, but just not as often as GT. Almost every poster uses it now, once again possibly something borrowed from Toriyama's illustrations. With colours besides Goku, things overall look fairly similar to the Boo arc. Some posters still use a more brown-orange colour for skin tones, which once again you don't really see in the anime but more in the posters, with the exception of Goku of course. Although there is some slight noticeable changes such as skin tones here, for example like Krillin, Pan and Trunks being coloured with a light shade of brown, rather than the more brownish orange/pink tone you can see being used on the characters to the left, especially Krillin here. And it is also worth pointing out that the colours used for Android and 18 look pretty much like something straight out of Dragon Ball Super, because partly one, Bulma's hair is more blue rather than the turquoise green it usually was depicted as in Z, but mostly because the colours, for lack of a better term, are more washed out and pale like in Super. And what I mean by this is that in posters especially, but also usually in the series, more vibrant colours were used for the shading, especially when there was only two tones being used. For example, look at Vidal's shirt here, which uses two very vibrant and distinct colours for the shading. But it is worth pointing out that this poster was drawn from my knowledge by Tadayoshi Yamamoru, who also does the character designs for Dragon Ball Super and a lot of promotional artwork. Thus, this could be seen as a small hint of what his future work would later become and the stylistic choices we would later see. Vegeta is also oddly given almost the same skin tone here as Goku for some reason, but this is more of a one-off. Now, wrapping it up on GT's colour scheme, the Super Saiyan hair surprisingly didn't change at all, especially when powered up. It still featured the varied range of colours Z did, such as the light orange tone for the shading, or a sort of clay brown in the hair as a third tone, and the skin also, when in the Super Saiyan form, still became some sort of shade of pink. The only change, however, is when a user isn't in, I guess, a powered up state or powering up, etc. The user's hair would usually have a white base colour and a pale yellow for the shading, accompanied by some sort of greyish ivory colour, whereas in GT, instead of a white base colour it's just a pale yellow and the shading becomes a more golden yellow. And finally, with this poster, it's kind of interesting because overall there are two different artists that seem to have done the promotional art, and one being Tadayoshi Yamamoru, although the other artist is unknown. However, when looking at Yamamoru's posters, the colours for the hair hasn't changed too much and it's pretty much the same, and the style of the art is fairly close to the look of the series direction, that being GT of course, with the slightly less angular designs, done pretty well. However, this other unknown artist's work looks exactly like the promotional artwork from Dragon Ball Z in every aspect, such as the deep orange shades for the hair, which Yamamoru still does use, although the colours used in this picture are exactly the same as this poster here, for example, which was done by the same artist I assume. But also, skin tones are more of a pinkish orange like in Z, unlike in GT where I mentioned before how they're more yellowish/brown colours. And his drawing style, whoever this is, doesn't seem to incorporate the newer designs, but also seems to use the older colours as well. Additionally, the line work is sharp like Z, and features such as the hair isn't simplified. Like, for example, you can see here with both Trunks and Goku in their Super Saiyan form how there are more strands of hair than how they are depicted in Yamamoru's work, where he has kind of simplified the designs, which is once again something seen similar in Dragon Ball Super. And finally, let's get to Dragon Ball Super. So this time I was able to find the character sheets, and let's of course break it down with Goku real quick. So obviously for one, Goku isn't a yellow, brown, tan anymore like GT, but his color scheme is slightly different. The base color is a yellowish white instead of a pinkish white, and a beige color is used for the secondary shading, which are similar colors you would see Super Saiyan 4 Goku with at times. And the most notable comparison can be seen when looking at this character sheet from Dragon Ball Super, which is just a recolor of one from Z. But anyway, the Dragon Ball Super design has a pale white for the base color with a slight orange undertone. The secondary shade also is brown with orange undertones. And finally, a sandy brown for the third shade. Again, like with GT, you can see this trend of moving away from the pinkish skin tones and using more brown colors for the shading. Again, that's not to say Dragon Ball Z never used brown shades, which it definitely did. It's just they weren't used as predominantly and had pinkish / red undertones usually. Whereas with GT, it was more brown colors with yellow undertones, and with Super, it's shades of brown with orange undertones. And in the anime, it's pretty much the same orange / brown tones are used consistently, and used on a varied range of characters such as Krillin and Master Roshi, although at least Master Roshi, I guess, doesn't look like a fossil anymore like he did in GT. And with posters, the colours hardly vary like they did with Z, and almost the same as the anime with the brown shades being used predominantly. And of course, the style in which things are shaded, I should quickly mention, was changed. For example, notice the shading curves around instead of outwards like it often did in Z, and even GT is where you started to see this. However, it wasn't that predominant in GT as it is in Super, and of course highlights are used a heap more again than they ever were in GT, and are almost always seen in an episode. Now, has the Super Saiyan hair been kept pretty much the same like GT? Well, no, not really. Super made a lot of changes in this regard. Now, the base colour is still a pale yellow, however, the secondary shade is sort of a golden yellow but with light brown undertones, and also the skin tones for the base become a pale white with yellow undertones, and the secondary shade is just a deeper shade of brown, which of course is a huge difference to how the Super Saiyan transformation was portrayed when powering up in Z and GT, as I mentioned before, with the hair almost always having that deep shade of orange, and the skin tones were often some shade of pink while in this state, but when not powering up, the hair would become a white, pale yellow, etc. Whereas now it seems to stay pretty much the same colour as when powering up, so not only is it a colour change, but there is also very little difference colour wise overall when powering up. Of course, like Z and GT, the colours would change. Of course, like Z and GT, the colours could change between episodes, such as Vegeta in this example being given a deep orange-brown for the shading of the hair. So it's not like the colours are always the exact same, but overall Super is pretty consistent with less orange and more yellow/brown colours being used. Although weirdly enough, when Goku has gone to Super Saiyan 3, the older colour scheme comes back with the pink skin tones and the deep orange and yellow tones used for the hair, which is even more strange because the character sheets for Dragon Ball Super never depicted Super Saiyan 3 this way. Although this image from the Tournament of Power right here, I remember something about the key animator who worked on the scene used the old character sheets from Z instead of the newer ones provided by Yamamoru, but I can't exactly remember on the full story, so don't quote me on that exactly. But the same classic colours can be seen again randomly with the That's My Bulma scene, but yet throughout the series you never really see these colours to depict a Super Saiyan again. But maybe it's because those were the colours used in the original scene from Battle of the Gods, but honestly I have no idea. And with posters it's pretty much the same as the anime, and it's actually pretty hard to find posters of a Super Saiyan in the newer promotional work because they're either in their base form or Goku and Vegeta are in SSB. But finally, after all that, my final conclusion: which show followed up on how characters were depicted at the end of Z the best and looked better in general as well? Well, that is really hard to say because both made drastic changes in opposite areas to each other, but I guess I would have to go with GT. Because anatomy wise, GT kept that bulky look for the majority of the cast, and as I said way back, not everyone in Super was skinny, but overall I feel like for characters like Goku, Vegeta, and even Gohan look closer to Z, but with the face, both Super and GT had episodes where it looked like something straight out of Z, but then had episodes where it is completely different to anything seen previous in either show. Then have scenes where they look the same as each other, and so honestly I can't say confidently which one is closer. But in the character sheets themselves, I guess Super is just that bit closer, but in an actual episode I couldn't say. But with colours again, kind of confusing since I think the tones used for Vegeta and especially Goku of course were closer to Z, but yet other characters such as Trunks, Gohan were much different, and GT was closer in this regard. But when looking at the hair color for Super Saiyan and the colors depicted when powering up, GT is the winner all day, and on the side, GT doesn't use highlights as much, and the shading isn't as sharp and jagged as it was in Super. And the majority of the times, usually the shading is drawn was pointing outwards instead of inwards, like I was explaining with Super. In this scene, for example, it looks more natural than it can look in Super, because when looking closely, you can see how the colors aren't applied so angular and straight. And I guess since GT was animated using traditional methods, thus being colored on celluloid rather than digitally, you get that same feel and aesthetic as Dragon Ball Z, although the filter in both Dragon Ball Super Broly and the Tournament of Power did help in giving that classic Z feel, especially the backgrounds in DBS Broly, which looked hand painted to me and really felt like something ripped straight out of Z. However, to be fair, we are discussing the main series and not so much the movies, and overall I would have to say GT is the winner in regards to art style, because in my opinion, it followed up closer to Z and didn't feel as stiff as the designs could in Super, and I feel like the artwork for like an average episode of GT overall was better for the most part. Although if Dragon Ball Super does start up again and Shintani is doing the character designs and they use the same filter scene in Dragon Ball Super Broly and animators are given more freedom without their art styles being heavily corrected as well, and a better production schedule on top of that, well, Super might beat GT in the near future by a milestone. But where things are at the moment, that might be a while, and GT, in my regards, in the meantime, until that happens, will hold the victory. So thank you everyone for watching this video. This video probably took the most time and effort out of any video I've done so far. Discussing all the colors took so much longer than I ever originally imagined. Like, I thought I would finish up this video about 3 weeks ago, but that obviously didn't happen. I actually considered splitting this up into 2 parts, but I decided to contain it all in one video, and I had a lot of fun at the end of the day making this one, and I did enjoy discussing the art styles of Dragon Ball, and I hope you enjoyed it too. So thank you once again, and I'll see you next time.